show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
GB News on your television and on your radio. On tonight's Mark Steyn show, Putin strikes and then jeers. So what are you going to do about it? Joe Biden peers woozily into his teleprompter. Boris Johnson imposes tough sanctions. And the Kremlin does its best not to giggle. Plus, we have a new regular feature, Globalist Gag Night, and a stellar lineup of guests, but not as stellar as you, the one part of the show we can't do without. Let me know what's on your mind. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet me at gbnews. All that coming up after the news with Miranda Shankar.
Thank you, Mark. The top stories this hour. The US president has announced a raft of financial sanctions following Russia's decision to invade eastern Ukraine. Joe Biden says President Putin's actions are a flagrant violation of international law, which demand a firm response. The US will now introduce tough economic sanctions and will also target Russia's elite as well as their family members. Joe Biden also authorized the deployment of additional forces and equipment to strengthen their Baltic allies, saying it is a defensive move, but the US has no intention to fight Russia.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as he indicated and asked permission to be able to do from his Duma. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? This is a flagrant violation of international law and demands a firm response from the international community.
Well, the move comes after the UK government imposed its own sanctions. The Prime Minister announced action against 5 Russian banks and 3 very high net worth individuals. Boris Johnson told MPs that Russia's troop deployment amounts to a renewed invasion of the country.
We will not allow Putin to drag our continent back into a Hobbesian state of nature where aggression pays and might is right. And it is precisely because the stakes are so high that Putin's venture in Ukraine must fail.
Well, meanwhile, Russia says it's started evacuating its diplomatic personnel from Ukraine because they're receiving death threats. The move comes after President Vladimir Putin was given the green light to deploy armed forces abroad for peacekeeping tasks by the Russian parliament. But there are fears the vote could open the door for a broader attack on Ukraine. President Putin says the situation on the ground in Donbass will dictate the actions of the military. NATO's Secretary General says it's not too late to step back.
We have over 100 jets at high alert, and there are more than 120 Allied ships at the sea from the high north to the Mediterranean. This is the most dangerous moment in European security for a generation. But Europe and North America continue to stand strong together in NATO, united and committed to defend and protect each other.
Well, in other news, severe flood warnings have been issued for parts of the West Midlands and Yorkshire. The Environment Agency says water levels could still rise in areas around the rivers Severn and Ouse after heavy rain fell during Storm Franklin. Flood-hit communities are urging the government now to fund permanent defences after dozens of homes were evacuated. Well, on TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Mark Steyn.
Well, Vladimir Putin has made his move and is about to face the savage, terrifying reprisals of a united West that has never been more serious. You just saw with Nigel on his show, Joe Biden peering woozily into his teleprompter and giving a tough response before being led back down to his rec room to watch the rerun of Angela Lansbury in Murder, She Wrote. He doesn't like to miss that. How does Putin know we're deadly serious? Because Joe Biden dispatched Kamala Harris to the Munich Security Conference.
I mean, listen, guys. We're talking about the potential for war in Europe. I mean, let's really take a moment to understand the significance of what we're talking about. It's been over 70 years. And through those 70 years, as I mentioned yesterday, there has been peace and security. We are talking about the real possibility of war in Europe. So our position is for us very clear, which is as a leader, which we have been, bringing together the allies, working together around our collective and unified position, that we would all, not just prefer, we desire, we believe, it is in the best interest of all that there is a diplomatic end to this moment.
It's important to understand that you, me, all of us are in a moment, and we want that moment to end diplomatically before the next moment comes along. Meanwhile, Western trade sanctions are already beginning to bite. Vladimir Putin is running out of socks to laugh off. I was trying to think of what Kamala's stirring bit of rhetoric reminded me of. Churchill, Lord Palmerston, Abe Lincoln, and then I remembered, oh no! She reminded me of me back when I was 12 or 13 and teacher called on me in class to talk about a set book I hadn't bothered reading. I mean, listen, guys, it's great to be here with you today in Europe. We've had roughly 70, 20, 90, 40 years of peace in Europe, give or take, since the Second European War of 1937, 1954 or thereabouts. And all we're saying is give peace a chance for another 70 years approximately. That's the significance of this moment. A significance that is momentous in that we're talking about the real possibility of war in Europe for approximately 30 years. So my duty as a leader is to seize this moment, not too roughly, not like a squad of Mounties seizing an elderly lady in Ottawa, but in a way that brings together all our allies to sit around and contemplate this moment and do the hard work of coming together around the moment in a unified position on what this moment means for this landmass we call Europe. And only then, by recommitting ourselves to do the hard work of flying around to different cities in Europe, European cities, if you will, can we bring this moment to a peaceful end. Her Britannic Majesty's government has slammed Russia like the Ottawa police slamming a 4'10" great-grandpa. The Prime Minister has imposed sanctions on 5 banks and 3 oligarchs who've been under US sanctions for the last 4 years, so I doubt it makes much difference to them, and to any member of the Duma who voted to recognize the Eastern Ukraine republics. So in other words, Mr. Johnson is treating these Russians less harshly than Trudeau treats someone who gave $50 to the Canadian truckers via Give, Send, Go. Let me know what you think. GB Views at gbnews.uk. You can tweet me at GBNews. John OSullivan is president of the Danube Institute in Hungary and a former speechwriter for Mrs. Thatcher. And we're always interested in his geopolitical insight. I wonder, though, if sometimes the geopolitical insight doesn't boil down to that Putin guy is serious and we're a global laughingstock. Both Biden and Harris have projected weakness just in the... I mean, he didn't even wait for her to get back to the United States, Putin, before making a mockery of everything she'd said.
Quite right. If you were wanting to be serious, if you want to make a strong impression, the very first thing you would do is take off that mask, which made it difficult to hear what she was saying in the first place. Not that that was a great disadvantage, of course, but still it demonstrated that she's really more interested in demonstrating her fidelity to the panoply of anti-COVID declarations than to anything to do with the war. Now, what she said ended, insofar as you could tell she was ending, with a plea for diplomacy. Now, right away, you know, if somebody who's engaged in a war, although we're not actually a war in which we said we won't actually fight, you would not begin by saying diplomacy is the only thing that counts. He's got the advantage because he's chosen his time. Putin is a serious operator, and although his economy is not great, I mean, it's scarcely grown since 2014. Nonetheless, his finances are in good shape. Not going to be easy to damage his finances. Secondly, he's actually assembled a formidable armed force with the latest weapons. There's no doubt that the situation of the Ukrainians is better than it was. They've got a lot of weapons that they didn't have. They've had 8 years of training, and they know that they do have support from others. But that support is not going to extend to fighting. So at the moment, what we are saying to them is, we will give you every support short of help. And as you fight if to defend your country, you can depend on us to cheer you along. Now, I don't think that's good enough. And I'm sure the Ukrainians don't. But the fact is, we don't have the ability at the moment to do much in the military area. What we have to do now, or in the short term, our job now is really to build up our defenses in a much stronger way than we've considered. At the moment, we have a NATO target of 2% of GDP in spending. In the Cold War, it was 3%, and it's got to get back there. That's just the first. The second is, his biggest weapon is our dependence on him for all kinds of energy. And now that's something which Boris Johnson, in his speech at Munich, said he would tackle seriously. But can you really say that the West is going to tackle their energy dependence on the Russians seriously if at the same time they proclaim their intention in going ahead to net zero, which they themselves admit involves sacrifices in energy terms, making it less reliable and more expensive? And I personally think the situation at the moment is horrible from almost every angle except one. It is a really serious wake-up call that we've got to stop pursuing ideological utopian will-o'-the-wisps and tackle real problems. And the real problems are we're outgunned, we're outplayed, and at the moment, an ally is offering us, is asking for our help, and we're doing helpful things, but they are the people who are going to do the dying. And that's something we should be ashamed of.
Even if we weren't ashamed of it, John, and we actually did go in militarily, against the Red Army, I would bet that NATO would lose. They lost to goat herds with fertilizer in Afghanistan. There's no clear sign that the buffoons at the Pentagon, with all their medals going down from their shoulder to halfway to their kneecaps, are capable of actually winning a war. They're great if you want to pick a transgender admiral or have a celebrate diversity day. They could do so. Putin knows that our guys are not, and the British Army, by the way, which was relatively immune to some of that rubbish, has recently held a day of diversity reflection. You know, Putin doesn't think Putin knows that we don't want to go to war, because if we go to war, we'll lose. How's that?
Well, I think that's an amusing and clever case. But let me put it this way to you. It's perfectly true that we didn't do very well against unarmed goat herds and people who were planting unexploded bombs by the side of the road. I don't think that's because although we had all these weapons, although we have the training, although we had bravery galore in Afghanistan and Iraq, nonetheless, we handicapped ourselves with the rules of engagement, for one thing, all the time. I don't think that and if the British Army and the US forces and others, NATO forces in general, were fighting the Red Army, I don't think we'd have those our hands tied behind our back. I mean, I think we're realistic to know that there's no way you can fight a Red Army without actually being prepared to inflict terrible damage. In fact, if you think about it, one of the biggest advantages that Putin has over us is that he makes it clear at every moment that he can take any amount of pain we impose on him, and we cannot do so. And I think we realize that's a psychological advantage in this crisis, which we at the moment find it hard to match, because we have lost the habit of thinking with deep seriousness about these kind of military and political and economic crises. We can get that back, and we probably will if he invades seriously. Not this invasion by degrees, but if he goes in and there is a serious war, and that's still very likely. If he does that, I think we'll see things that wake us up. And I don't believe we continue to carry on this game in which we don't seriously prepare for a major conflict. As I say, this is a wake-up call for us. I know we've had other wake-up calls which we've ignored, but I don't think we could ignore the invasion of Ukraine, the taking of a city like Kiev, the bombings, the destruction of cities, the refugees, all of the things which we thought were not likely to happen next door. Yes, they were going to happen almost next door, and we haven't coped well with the refugee crisis at all. But nonetheless, this was something which I think will be unavoidable, unseeable. Again, I mean, you won't be able to forget it happened.
Well, let me just pick up on that, because he's been quite clever here with these two breakaway republics, in that although they're part of Ukraine as far as the global world order is concerned, the Russian army is actually probably the most popular army you'd see in the streets there, certainly more popular than not just the British or the Americans, but even the Ukrainian army might be. You're a great scholar of Ireland, and you know that in Ireland there are a lot of people who want to be just Irish, and then there's a big chunk that want to be both Irish and British. And that is a bit like Eastern Ukraine. In Ukraine, there's people who just want to be Ukrainian, but in a part of the country, there's people who want to be Ukrainian and Russian as well.
That's perfectly true. And as we've seen in Ireland, this is a great political problem more than it is a military one. But think of this: until the British Army actually executed people in 1916 following the Easter Uprising, it had the support of the majority of the Irish population. Irish soldiers of both communities, as we call them now, both the northern Protestants and the southern Catholics, they were fighting, and fighting heroically, in the trenches in France. It was only when, for understandable reasons, the British army decided that you can't rebel against us in the middle of a war. We have to be punished for that this decision was taken. I think the decision turned out badly. Now, if you look at Luhansk and the other province there, I think even in those areas, the majority of people would vote to remain with Ukraine. There's been a big change in Ukrainian sentiment. The balance between the people who want to remain part of Russia or to become part of Russia again, and those who want to be a free Ukrainian society has changed dramatically. And that's probably Putin's biggest problem, the thing he has to worry about most, because yes, he can probably defeat the Ukrainian army, but what happens then? Are they going to stay there? In Stalin's day, they would have just moved millions of people to the middle of Asia, which is what Stalin did. But they're not. That's not going to be possible. So that will be a real problem for him. I think it's perfectly possible that we could pursue a ruthless policy of continuing to provide weapons, arms, encouragement to people fighting and occupying force from Russia. I think that would be Machiavellian. It might well work. It would bleed and drain the Russian army. I wouldn't be very happy about fighting to the last Ukrainian myself. I think that it's something that we should be ashamed about, and if we think of that. But for the moment, therefore, I don't think that we have a military way of stopping Putin. We have a way of inflicting very important and severe damage on him. And that damage will get worse and worse, and his support may well turn to him and say, because now the Germans, and I didn't expect this, the Germans are saying they won't, they will abandon Nord Stream 2, or begin to do so.
Well, John, I just want to, since you brought up Joseph Stalin, I just want to switch topics on you and turn to the Stalin de nos jours, Justin Trudeau. You made a very good point when you were last on this show that the right to protest is a left-wing thing now. So if you're Antifa, if you're Extinction Rebellion, if you're Black Lives Matter, and you are essentially rioting and rampaging around in support of making the left-wing state even more left-wing, they'll let you do that. But if you want to, if you want to protest from a right of centre perspective, the state will clamp down on you. And no sooner were those words out of your mouth than from John O'Sullivan's mouth to Justin Trudeau's ears. That's a pretty what happened in Canada pretty much exemplifies your thesis, doesn't it?
I think the most sinister thing about this is the fact that he obviously has decided, as even the editors of The Economist and people on the left say, have seen clearly, he wanted to have his own January the 6th. And he thought that the truckers would provide it. But it turned out the truckers were quite popular. They were multiracial, quite a lot of Sikhs in turbans were there. They were dancing, they were having a party. It was hard to portray them as sinister. So he lied. He kept repeating that they were racists, they were homophobes, they were white supremacists. There was one man who was carrying a swastika who was quickly disavowed by everyone else at the demonstration, and yet it's as if he was the only member of the demonstration, if you listen to Justin Trudeau. It is quite extraordinary. I think it's also interesting, Mark, that there doesn't seem to be much interest among Canadian journalists in finding out who that man was. I mean, I think they have the terrible suspicion that he might not really have been a trucker or a supporter of the organization, and they're absolutely determined that that would be an illicit investigation, so they leave it be. The other thing is, as you will have noticed, well, maybe you want to ask another question on this rather, but was going to say, look at the woman who organizes, one of the organizers. She is facing apparently a 10-year jail sentence, and she's been denied bail, although there is absolutely zero chance of her either wanting to abscond or being able to if she did. And I think, again, the administration of the law means that if you're pursuing a progressive cause, you'll be released. In fact, if you're a progressive who's committing a murder these days in parts of America, you won't go to jail at all. You'll be released quite quickly on bail. But if you're somebody who is, the truckers don't seem to me to be particularly anti-progressive, but they defy one of the current obsessions of the progressive world, which is everybody should be guarding themselves against COVID indefinitely. And as a result of that, they're now regarded as public enemy number one by the government, but not by most people.
No, they're absolutely disgraceful. That lady, Ms. Leach, that you mentioned, by an absolutely disgraceful judge, Madam Justice Bourgeois, of all names, and she is a former Liberal Party candidate too. That's all very cosy. Thank you, John O'Sullivan. We'll get to your reaction next. And Naomi Wolf and Brendan O'Neill are here for some big picture stuff on these topics. All straight ahead on a Tuesday Steyn Show.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Breaking news from down under. Chickenpox is spreading through Queensland faster than the Omicron. What's up with that? More gain of function, fun and games. We're going to stay on this. Let's get to your emails on who we should be sanctioning. These Russian oligarchs or maybe Canadian truckers. Gaia says, I'll go with the third option. We should be sanctioning Trudeau. John says, how ironic, the woke West are demonizing the USSR plus community who simply want to self-identify as Russian. So that's like LGBTQ plus community who simply want to self-identify. And D via Twitter says, Trudeau is the real tyrant. Well, we're not actually comparing him to Joseph Stalin, but Canadian prime ministers ought to be held to a higher standard than Joseph Stalin. We're introducing a new feature here on the Mark Steyn Show, Globalist Open Mic Night, in which every week a sinister globalist kicks loose and does a little improv comedy. Here is the world-renowned inventor of Windows 98 turned vaccine promoter, Bill Gates, speaking at the same Munich security conference as Kamala Harris. Don't ask me why the inventor of Windows 98 gets invited to the Munich security conference. That's why he's a sinister globalist and you're not. But here he is with his quartet of backing singers, Bill Gates and the Broken Windows, just riffing and loosing off a few thigh slappers from the Gates gag book.
About masks. I think there are a lot of people in America who are confused about whether they should be wearing a mask. And in the United Kingdom, for example, they've scrapped that altogether.
Well, that's interesting. You know, what is the downside of wearing a mask? I mean, it's got to be tough. You know, you have to wear pants. I mean, this is tough stuff. These societies are so cruel. Why did they make you wear pants? I'm trying to figure it out.
We're very glad you have yours on.
Well, as you can hear, that just brought the house down. Boy, those Microsoft Office parties must have been a riot. Why, Miss Jones, you're beautiful without my pants on. To accompany our new regular feature, Globalist Open Mic Night, we're introducing, in the interests of balance, a companion feature, Globalist Closed Mic Night. This is where we focus on elected representatives who try to bring up the subject of how much influence the Davos jet set, Klaus Schwab and the gang, have over our government. From the House of Commons in Ottawa.
The Honourable Member for Oshawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I listened to my colleague's speech. I had a constituent that wanted me to ask a question about outside interference to our democracy. Klaus Schwab is the head of the World Economic Forum, and he bragged how his subversive WEF, World Economic Forum, has, quoted, infiltrated governments around the world. He said that his organization had penetrated more than half of Canada's cabinet. And I was wondering, in the interest of transparency, could the member please name which cabinet ministers are on board with the WEF's agenda? My concern is the deputy.
Order. I know he was. I know that the member was in a really good question there, but the audio is really bad and the video is really bad as well. And I apologize. I don't know if the member. Okay. Let's try again.
So the best way to reassure the citizenry that their governments aren't in thrall to sinister globalists from the World Economic Forum is to cut the microphones of anyone who asks about it. Did the audio sound that bad to you? Odd. The international best-selling author Naomi Wolf joins me now. You can read her on Substack. You can't read her on Twitter because they banned her, but we're always glad to see her. Naomi, you've been writing about these globalists recently, and you did quite a huge, big dip into it, which is to explain how, more or less since 1950, we have bred a class apart of elites that don't feel English or Scottish or Canadian or American or French or German, but instead feel they belong to a kind of transnational global elite. And certainly we've seen that in Canada and elsewhere in the last few weeks. Last couple of years, really, across the Western world.
Yeah, very true, Mark. That essay on my Substack, which kind of discloses what the thought processes are of this elite class, among whom I used to hang out, is quite chilling because it explains how people can make decisions at a far remove from the men and women who are their fellow countrymen and women that harm them, but they have no sense of being a tyrant or being a bad person. But that essay is now quite out of date since the declaration by Justin Trudeau of emergency powers in Canada last week. And I've written another Substack essay, which is quite viral, which is actually warning Canadian parliamentarians what martial law really means. They seem kind of in that dangerous hangover state that I continually warn people about from my reading of history and of dying democracies, in which people, especially parliamentarians or members of Congress, keep thinking they're living in an orderly constitutional civil society or an orderly rule of law civil society, and they don't realize that that world is dead. So parliamentarians, in my essay, I don't mean to alarm people, but at this point in history, it isn't a kind of let's voice our unhappiness. It's a kind of time to arrest the traitor moment, because it is arrest or be arrested. Opposition leaders at this point are in danger. Civil society leaders are in danger. Journalists and editors are in danger. And I just want to note that my own President Biden, for whom I, regrettably voted, he didn't follow the violent crackdown in Ottawa on peaceful protesters with outrage or condemnation or diplomatic sanctions. He actually followed suit by quietly extending an emergency powers order in the United States in an open-ended format, which allows him to channel billions of dollars to boards of health, which, just to update your viewership, has been quietly creating regulations that would allow detention without charge or trial if you're exposed to a contagious illness. So that's our Trojan horse. And the last thing I want to say to really alarm people, because the time is right to be alarmed, is that there are these violent thugs posing or being represented as police in Ottawa. They're hard to identify because their patches are Velcro, they're gone. Same kind of violent thugs in Paris. You see these kind of security forces. And I just want to really warn people from my reading of history, we don't know who those violent people are. And there are mercenary armies for hire around the world, whether it's Blackwater, now called SHE, or whether it's other security services, that make it very, very dangerous to be in a country that has declared martial law and that has these violent, unidentifiable, possible contractors or mercenaries, in the streets. And to me, as an American, I think we should be incredibly worried for our own safety and our own security. Not only that we have had emergency powers extended, which is a way of curtailing congressional checks and balances, but that these entities could be amassing on our border. And I think, honestly, it's racism that if there was martial law declared in Mexico and unnamed thugs massing on the border with, military-type gear in Mexico, we'd be freaking out. But those nice Canadians are doing it, and we're not incredibly scared for our own national security. So to me, I think the World Economic Forum is front and center with this, as we see in lockstep around the world. And I think that different countries, notably Australia and Canada, have been petri dishes, Israel too. And now Canada is the demo for how you finalize the takedown of a democratic civil society. So the rest of us should be very, very worried and shoring up our own rule of law and arresting people for committing treason at this point.
Well, you quote in that piece Canada's treason law, which is largely about striking at the person of Her Majesty specifically and directly. And the Queen is mostly holed up in Windsor Castle these days, so that's hard to do. But interestingly, if you ask most people in Western societies about treason laws now, and certainly most people under a certain age, they would scoff at that. They would think it sounds like something from medieval times. They're not invested in nation states to the same degree. And indeed, treason is a funny concept if we're all one big globalist happy family. And so I wonder if in a sense the ship hasn't sailed and we have socially engineered hundreds of millions of people in free nation states who don't understand that that's the principal organizing block of a peaceful world.
So you're asking the right questions, Mark, but I think respectfully you're looking at the wrong part of Canadian treason law. It's true that it starts out with don't harm the Queen's body, and fair enough. But it goes on to define treason in Canada very broadly, including waging war, very broadly defined, against Canada, or conspiring with people who are waging war against Canada. Until we know who those security forces are who are beating peaceful protesters, and by the way, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms absolutely guarantees their right to do that. In fact, it guarantees Canadian law guarantees the right, and I think one MP took me up on this, to sue Justin Trudeau in a civil court for depriving them of their democracy. That's unlawful too. He is committing treason, according, by my read, according to the rest of treason law. So it's worth taking a look at that law in its entirety. But I do agree with you that the last 30 years have seen a massive propaganda campaign to condition younger people, especially, to not be patriotic and to not care about the nation state. And I think, there are a lot of things wrong with nation states. There are a lot of things wrong with patriotism wrongly deployed. But a nation state with a democracy or a parliament that is duly elected is the best bulwark of human rights law and of individual rights. And absolutely, the globalists, I used to think that was a nonsensical term, now I'm all too scared of it, they absolutely would like a world in which we don't care if we're British or French or American or Canadian. It's all just one giant parking lot, and our scope as citizens is confined to tweeting on Twitter or, playing video games. They would love that, because the easiest way to subdue a population is to open their borders, flow in, I'm very pro legal immigration and very pro melting pot, but if you flow in people who are not citizens, you don't have a democracy anymore, right? Give the vote to people who aren't citizens, which is what happened in New York, and make people not have any allegiance to their history, their culture, their language, their home. And we need to push back. I mean, it's beautiful to me to see the citizens of Canada wrapping themselves in their flag, because the flag also represents their democracy, their human rights, their Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Where does, in a Western society, where does politics come in this? I mean, you and I are generally, you've just said you've voted for Joe Biden. I couldn't imagine doing that in a million years. You're generally regarded as left of center. I'm fanatically right wing by comparison, but particularly in the United States, but to the same degree in the United Kingdom, Canada, Europe. Politics seems the more vicious it gets, the more parochial and unimportant it gets, so that we don't seem to decide great questions, but it's like some extreme sports league where we beat each other up more over less and less that matters.
Well, you're 1,000% correct. I mean, something everyone has to see by now is that the World Economic Forum graduates are on the left and the right. And that's just brilliant. If you're going to kind of take over the democracies of the world and crush them, you really need to have the Tory, Boris Johnson speaks to the World Economic Forum, and you need to have the liberal, Chrystia Freeland, whom I used to know in circles of struggling journalists in New York, and you can have the Democrats in the United States. It doesn't matter, right? They're all enacting the exact same lockstep lockdown policies, the same COVID fetishizing policies. They're refusing to let people kind of emerge and retrieve their rights. They want the new normal. They're using the same sound bites. As a former political consultant, I recognize a global, highly focus grouped campaign, and they're all using the same script. So I think we need to throw left and right out the window in a way. And what I'm seeing, which is quite, again, moving and important, and it is the only thing that will save us, is that in the United States, at least, and in many countries, people at the grassroots level are discarding left and right, or whatever the version of it is in their country. And what's becoming clear is, the 1 or 2% who want to oppress us, keep us, introduce a new serfdom forever, and everyone else who wants their lives back, wants their liberties back, believes in representative democracy, are other arguments about, abortion rights or LGBTQ rights, or, whether there should be prayer in school. Those are absolutely tertiary compared to the existential threat facing us right now as, free peoples in Europe and Britain and the United States and now Canada. And we have to wake up and form common cause. So you're right to see that there's a pointlessness to partisan divisions. They want us to be fighting over those tiny scraps as they align to take all our goods and freedoms away.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. We're going to have to come up with a way of making elections not only honest, but actually more significant and more in touch with the real concerns of free peoples before they lose those freedoms. Naomi Wolf, it's always great to see you, and we hope people will follow you on Substack and read both those pieces. Thank you very much. Coming up, we have Stump the Steyn, Ask Me Anything, GBViews at gbnews.uk. You can Twitter me. But don't touch that dial, because we're also swinging right back with Brendan O'Neill.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Coming up on Dan Wootton Tonight, the lockdown inquiry, the only place where those responsible for COVID carnage will be held to account, continues. I'll be welcoming to the stand Professor Carl Hannigan, Director of Oxford University's Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, who'll be asking why there was no motivation to learn to live with the virus, and one of the most vocal advocates for freedom, social media activist Zuby. Plus, the woman who accused Joe Biden of sexually assaulting her in the halls of Congress, Tara Reid, tells her story. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
We have breaking news in the hour or so since Joe Biden's speech. The ruble. The Russian ruble has gone up against the dollar. As John O'Sullivan mentioned earlier on the show, today Tamara Leach, one of the organisers of that Freedom Trucker convoy, was denied bail in Ontario Superior Court because of the judge's concern that she would re-offend, which seems an odd thing to say about someone who hasn't been convicted of offending first time round. Ms. Leach is looking at 10 years in jail, and Madam Justice Bourgeois, an almost too perfect name that no novelist or filmmaker could get away with, Madam Justice Bourgeois seems minded to give her that 10 years. By contrast, the actual violent protesters, the ones who beheaded the statue of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald in Montreal, and in an orgy of destruction on Canada Day last year, toppled statues of both Queen Victoria and our present sovereign lady, didn't even face charges, just letting off a bit of steam. Brendan O'Neill is chief political writer at Spiked. Brendan, you wrote a piece about this a couple of days ago that was interesting to me, that there are kind of high status protests in which the fellas toppling the statue of Her Majesty the Queen or BLM or Antifa essentially function as shock troops for the regime. And then there are low status protests like these Canadian truckers or the January 6th guys who have to be punished within an inch. Well, their lives have to be ruined. There's not a lot of equality before the law around anymore.
Absolutely not. And I think Canada right now is a perfect example of high status versus low status. So the most shocking sight for me and the most revealing sight was when a bunch of woke protesters turned up to have a counter protest against the truckers. And the woke protesters were chanting, "Trans rights are human rights." Now, the Ottawa truckers' protest had nothing whatsoever to do with trans issues or gender fluidity or all that other nonsense that woke people like to talk about. But what we had there were essentially, the upper class, highly educated, woke left bringing their high status opinions to bear upon these ruffians, these rough-necked working class truckers who they look upon with utter contempt. They were essentially reprimanding them with high status opinions. That's really what was taking place. And I think what's so fascinating about the truckers' protests is that it is a new form of class war. We've got the working classes who want better working conditions and the right to earn a living. And the new ruling class is the woke regime, the kind of Trudeau tyranny, which rails against these workers by accusing them of being racist or transphobic or insufficiently woke. So this is the new class war that we're witnessing in Canada, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're talking about this on a day when Vladimir Putin has just made his move in Ukraine. You keep thinking when people show up at a protest and it's nothing to do with transgender rights, but they're waving all these transgender slogans, that at some point something is going to happen in the world that will force us to get real. But I mean, if we woke up one morning and saw that the Ayatollahs had just nuked some country, maybe, or Kim Jong-un, maybe by accident. He was aiming at Japan, but he accidentally hit Slovenia. You get the feeling that we digest it for 10 minutes and then all go back to talking about net zero and transgender bathrooms.
Yeah, and pronouns and all the rest of it. There's a fall of Rome element to all of this. So, despite all the various crazy things that are going on in the world, including the rise of new, literally barbaric movements in terms of ISIS and other forms of radical Islam, despite all of that disturbing stuff, you have people in the West with, time-rich millennials and people with far too much time and money on their hands obsessing over the most stupid stuff. Where do they fit exactly on the gender ruler? How should we refer to them? What are their pronouns? What's the correct speech to use in every single situation? They have these kind of bizarre linguistic obsessions. There's a real disconnect between reality, which feels increasingly unstable and tense, especially in geopolitical terms, and the world in which these people live, which is completely removed from everything else. So there's a kind of, Rome is falling, the barbarians are at the gates in some ways, and these people are fiddling around with their gender pronouns. And I think it's where the kind of the new ruling class is at the moment. I think they're very disorientated, very confused. They don't understand the world around them or the societies that they are ruling, and that's given rise to a pretty tense situation in lots of countries.
Well, there's a cynicism there too, though, isn't it? Because when you look at the people who rampage around from the left's point of view, in America, you get bailed. Well, if you even get bail, you'll be bailed out by a Kamala Harris staffer or by Kevin Spacey or Seth Rogen or another Hollywood celebrity. In Her Majesty's dominions, we don't have quite as many celebrities as that, but it doesn't matter because you can destroy all these statues, and they don't even charge you now. So that has to be just a cynical move that's just about power, doesn't it?
Oh, it's deeply cynical, and it's absolutely riddled with double standards. And I think as you were saying earlier, what the kind of BLM, Antifa, statue smashing movement, what that really represents is the shock troops of the new elites. That's why the Democrats in the US essentially gave a green light to some of those BLM riots in 2020. They saw it as a way of dislodging Trump or weakening Trump, and they refused to refer to it as looting. They even refused to refer to it as rioting. They said they were mostly peaceful protests. It's, people letting off steam. They basically gave a green light to that kind of behavior because they recognized in that movement, that kind of statue smashing, building burning movement, something that might be useful for them in terms of increasing their cultural and political power. So I think the same thing has happened in Canada, where, as you were saying earlier, people tore down statues and not very much happened to them. But as soon as ordinary working class people stand up for their rights and actually challenge the status quo, that's what these truckers are doing. They're challenging the status quo of technocratic governance, of the patrician woke government of which Justin Trudeau is such an expert. They're challenging that. They really are posing a threat to the status quo in the Western world. And that's why there has been such an extreme reaction and such extreme contempt from the commentariat, because they recognize that these protesters are raising important questions about how the world is run at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very good point there, Brendan, that they're happy. Someone like Justin Trudeau is happy to see people tearing down statues of Sir John A. Macdonald and Queen Victoria, because it's almost like he's the only icon. When you've erased history, he's all that's left, and that in itself is actually slightly disturbing. Thank you very much, Brendan O'Neill. Always appreciate it, and great to see you. Let's close things out. Oh, I gotta do this one. Ron Swansong says, could David Icke have been right about lizard people populating the world's leaders? In your opinion, which leader is most likely to be a lizard person? Love the show, by the way. I forget what gallery all these galaxy all these lizard people are from, but if I recall Mr. Icke correctly, the Princess of Wales told him just before she died that the Queen was, well, I think it's from Alpha Centauri, actually, the galaxy. But the Princess of Wales told David Icke shortly before she died that the Queen was one of the lizard people, shape-shifting lizard people from Alpha Centauri, and so is the entire Bush family. So is it hard to believe that Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern aren't also part of the lizard people? Stephen says, does Biden even know he's president? They tell him every 20 minutes, but it still slips his mind. And one more. Steve says, who do you think of our present MPs would be our best PM if we did end up going to war within NATO against Russian aggression? So you're asking me to pick which member of parliament would be best to lose to the Red Army. I don't think I'm going to go there. That'll do it. Dan Wooden's here to titillate your Tuesday. You'll want to stand well back for that. He's coming up. Stay safe, stay free.
Good evening. The winds are calming down at the moment, but they're going to pick up again tomorrow. A windy Wednesday with wet weather for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Largely dry day to come across most of England and Wales. This weather front's been pushing south today, and it's going to be followed by a similar one tomorrow. And as that one approaches, the isobars squeezing together, so the winds will increase through tomorrow. But at the moment, certainly compared to recent days, the winds are a lot lighter, and with clear skies, that's allowing temperatures to fall. So quite a cold night across England and Wales. But here comes that next band of rain into the northwest, and the winds picking up here as well. Enough of a breeze to stop too much of a frost, but certainly in the countryside, temperatures are likely to drop down close to zero. But a bright start for the Midlands, southern and eastern England on Wednesday. Some good spells of sunshine. The winds will strengthen, though. We do have a Met Office yellow warning across northeast England and southeast Scotland. Gusts of wind of 40, 50, maybe 60 miles an hour. A wet afternoon for Northern Ireland and central Scotland, and the rain starting to turn more and more to snow across the far northwest as colder air pushes in here, but quite mild still for England and Wales, where, bar the odd shower, most will have a dry day. We will see the rain pushing southwards, though, during Wednesday night, and then we're going to see more of the snow showers coming in, and we have another Met Office yellow warning for snow and wind across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland, and that lasts well into Thursday as well. We'll start with rain across East Anglia and the southeast on Thursday. That should scoot away, and then we'll see sunshine and showers, but these showers of snow could cause some problems with the snow really building up, especially on some of the higher routes. But even at low levels for a time, some snow on Thursday across western Scotland and Northern Ireland, perhaps even into parts of southeast Scotland. With those strong winds, that's going to make for some pretty hazardous driving conditions. Sunny spells for many elsewhere on Thursday, but it's going to feel cold wherever you are.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate.
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
Right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.